All right, so it sounds like, actually it doesn't sound like, it looks like Dwayne has audio issues. Whether or not he can actually hear us is up in the air. He clearly can't say anything to us, so it's going to be a little bit of a one-man show while he works through that. Um, so this is the DELEG interim. We purposely did not put slides together, mainly because we wanted this to be a working session with open discussions about what's going on. I had posted a proposed agenda in the mailing list. Essentially, we'll do a little bit of administrivia, and then the two big topics that we saw when as we were putting the agenda together was basically how much divergence we were seeing with the SVCB specification, and trying to figure out what we wanted to do about that. And then the second one was, what should authoritative servers and resolvers do when NS and DELEG records are both present? And so I'd open it up after that. If there are other topics people want to put on the agenda, I'm happy to add those to the other open issues for this meeting. And we can discuss any and all of those topics between now and 1800 UTC. So I will start with asking if anybody has issues with the agenda or if they have additions to the agenda. Paul?
So one topic that has come up in the last few days, general topic, not specific, is the possibility of changing what delegation means from the current, which is you delegate to name servers with names, to you delegate to name servers with IP addresses. That is, that delegation goes straight to IP addresses instead of names. I think that would be a valuable topic for us to have more discussion on here, especially because it does relate to the SVCB part.
That's a good point. I was assuming that would come up in some discussion with SVCB, but it may be worthwhile to have that conversation separate from the specification itself. Anybody else have topics they want to add? Peter?
Hi. I would say in more generic terms that perhaps discussing the wire format is maybe too early if we don't agree on what should be represented in the record, right? Because right now, what Paul brought up is basically deviation or change of what is like set of required fields and the set of fields which are optional, and that will influence the wire format for sure somehow. So perhaps as I said on the mailing list, I think that first we should come up with the best possible protocol for delegation, and then look whether it can be mapped onto SVCB and decide whether it's good enough to use SVCB or whether the deviations serve some useful purpose and give us advantage compared to just plain SVCB.
Yeah. I don't want to jump the gun, but I think you bring up a good point there, Peter. That was how I really wanted to start that SVCB conversation. And I know this was mentioned on the mailing list, and I see that a Tail mentioned this in the chat, that form follows function. So rather than spending a lot of time talking about how we diverge or how much do we diverge, if at all, from the SVCB specification, maybe the conversations around nailing down what are the capabilities that we need, and then figuring out where SVCB falls in providing that type of capability. Dwayne, I see you popped on for like a brief second.
Oh, I was just testing. I think I got my audio and stuff working now. Thanks.
Well, we can certainly hear you now, so at least that part works.
Yeah. Well, the camera works too, but you don't want to see me.
I will state that if assuming that Dwayne's at home, we are operating in a 10-hour time difference, so we're having all sorts of fun with this. So, all right. Any other topics people want to add to the list? All right. So by silence, I will assume that everyone's happy with the agenda. As everybody should know, Meet Echo records everything. So, this is all operating under the all the normal IETF rules and procedures. So, anything you say and or do will be recorded for posterity, for lack of a better term. So, so let's start with the discussion around what I have in the agenda as the SVCB specification, but I'd be interested in people's opinions on ignoring what the encoding, wire format, what have you looks like, and actually spending more time talking about what are the critical capabilities or forms that or functions that we need in order to get DELEG into a good state. So curious about people's opinions on what are those key functions, and can we actually capture them in a way that allows us to feed into the base specification. Tail.
Yeah, there actually is one last agenda batch. I want to make sure you
Okay.
leave time at the end that we have time for our marching orders as far as, what is expected from the document authors before the before our actual in-person meeting in Madrid. I anticipate we will need to get a rev out, but it would be just good to have from, direction from the chairs as far as next steps.
Duly noted. Thanks, Tail. Paul.
I saw Ben in the queue first, and so I wanted to give him a chance, but he dropped out. So I think where I've seen the list go on requirements is we asked to have direct and indirect, or direct and include, however you call that, and extensibility beyond that. So in my mind, saying direct or include, those are actions that at the end of whatever the resolver is going to do, it is going to have delegation information for the name servers. And people have talked a little bit about also later that we will have some actions that include doing something about DS records, whether they're included or not, whether some of the name servers only for this name only do name, address information, and others do DS, however that is, that's not current. So I think we have those two actions plus the needed extensibility for other actions. And we know from SVCB that another thing that is needed is we need to have, I don't know if you'll call them parameters or metadata or whatever about the servers that are being found. And that has to be flexible because we don't know all of what's going to be important to us in the future. So I think those are the two bases that we have had sort of agreement on forever coming into this. And now we have the third one, which I mentioned earlier, which is not agreed to in the working group at all yet, because it just got started. But it's one that I like, which is that a resolver actually thinks of the delegation as IP addresses, not as domain names of name servers, and that you would end up with a set of IP addresses as the delegation.
Thanks, Paul. Ben?
Hi, Ben Schwartz, Meta. I think we're talking about requirements beyond the ones that are already in our working group requirements document. I believe that there's another requirement that we should include, which is that there is a single DNS protocol. What I mean is stub resolvers talking to recursive resolvers should use the same protocol as recursive resolvers talking to authoritative DNS servers. In other words, the DELEG should essentially match the way that DNS transport is bootstrapped between stub and recursive. Or if that's not possible, then we should expand scope and try to build a new a new protocol bootstrap mechanism that basically can be matched between these two use cases. I do not think we should do that. I think we should stick. We already have put a lot of thought into how to establish stub to recursive connections. We should essentially reuse that work here. And functionally, what that means is that the service parameter set, which is used in RFC 9461, DDR, DNR for establishing stub to recursive connections, should also be present here so that it can be used in the same way to bootstrap recursive to authoritative connections. I think that's important for architectural parallelism, for code simplicity, and also because there are actually some cases where the recursive and authoritative roles are mixed. And it would be very confusing to have separate protocol establishment, transport establishment rules for both of those. So I think while DELEG's server selection and server finding rules are quite different, or goals are quite different from what Service B has normally been used for, I think the transport establishment is really the same and should be shared.
Thanks, Ben. Roy?
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Ben. So this working group is about extending delegations, and the focus should be on extending these delegations and the functionality we need for that. I think transport is a part of that, but it should not be leading the way we design this. And so I'm actually not that concerned about reusing SPCB or using SPCB, or that we have to have the exact same transport mechanism as, selection mechanism that we have for stub to resolver. Stub to resolvers, as you know, have nothing to do with delegations itself. So if we look at delegation extensions, I'm happy to reuse some of the key value pairs, but we should not be bound by the constraints that SPCB currently has. Thanks.
Thanks, Roy. Peter?
I would say it's funny that you think that the stub to resolver and resolver to authoritative is the same protocol, because in my mind it's definitely not the same protocol and never was. Because the way how the stub finds its resolver is completely different from how the resolver finds the authoritative. The rules for managing connections are also different, because the stub to resolver typically wants to keep the connection open for a long time, but from resolver to author.if, we definitely don't want to do that because there's like zillion resolvers talking to the same author.if. Also, the transfer protocols actually have changed because the DOH, for example, is massively used between stub and resolver, but it's not used almost at all between the resolver and author.if. And I could go on. So I think, and the underlying problem is that even though it looks like it's the same protocol, it's very much not the same protocol, because even though the message structure is the same, you can like use the same data structure almost, except for update and other crap like that. The meaning of the fields in the structure changes very much depending on the RD bit in the message. So basically there is a one bit which flips completely the semantics of the message. So I think that in the end, with the benefit of hindsight, I would say it would have been much better if the stub to resolver used different port number than the resolver to auth. So I think it's like, let's not go there. These protocols are already split, and I don't think that like reusing couple parameters here and there will make them same. No, the semantics will be different anyway, rules will be different anyway. So I think they are different protocols, so we don't need to pretend that they are same.
Thanks, Peter. Wes.
It's all an interesting discussion. I think that the one thing that we need to be clear about is when we say protocol, there's actually two different uses of it. We have this problem in the IETF all the time, right? There is the definition of the protocol on the wire and the bit format, and the types of records that can go back and forth, and there is the logistical protocol of this is a resolver, this is how I go about using those bits on the wire in order to achieve my biggest point, bigger point with, step one is request an NS record. Step two is if they don't have the address record, then go request the address record. All that type of stuff is a methodology for achieving the goals, and they are very different between the stub and the recursive. And even worse, there's really more than two types, right? Stubs and recursives, and then a whole bunch of weird things in the middle, like forwarders and middle boxes that get in the way and stuff too. The thing that I think strongly stand behind is no matter what the protocol is or what the on the wire format is, in a stub resolver, I still want to be able to get all data if I need it. In other words, even though, a stub resolver really shouldn't need a DELEG record, I want to be able to query it in case, I want it for some additional reason, right? That's how we solve extensibility and stuff into the future. So regardless of whether, and I think Peter's point about the RD bit is spot on, right? We have this one bit that greatly changes the entire semantics of how, operations work. But I would hate to go down any architectural path that doesn't allow all parties in this, ecosystem to be able to get at all data, regardless of whether it's a recursive or a stub.
So Wes, if I were going to kind of summarize what you said in relation to a couple of the earlier comments, is it really the case here that that there's always going to be this contention over whether somebody is a stub, a recursive, an authoritative? Sometimes they do other things, sometimes they do both things or multiple things. But if we think about it in the way that that Peter was describing it, as there is a set of messages that get exchanged from client to recursive, and that is fundamentally a separate protocol from what gets used by anybody who wants to retrieve the necessary information, whether it's all the records like you talked about, or it truly is a recursive who's trying to build up a response that goes back to the client.
Turn the question around and say, if I'm a server of any kind, recursive, authoritative, whatever, do I need to know what type of client is asking me a question? right? I mean, clearly it needs to know that it's hoping for recursion. Clearly it needs to know I want the DNSSEC records to go along with it. But I don't think it's appropriate for me to be able to say, you must tell me if you're just a silly stub resolver with very little CPU power, or you're actually a full recursion resolver yourself.
Peter. I think you're still muted.
Once again, sorry. We already have the bit which tells you who is asking, because the RD bit, kind of implicitly tells you whether it's recursive resolver or authoritative. So can you clarify your point? I'm kind of not following you.
So the RD bit indicates it's a feature. It's a feature of what you want out of the other side, right? It's a feature that you want recursion. There are a lot of recursive resolvers that point at something upstream and say, I want recursion from you, even though I'm also recursive, right? I disagree that the RD bit tells you the type of client on the other end.
Okay, I get your point. So what you are asking for again, because now I get your point about identifying the client, but I don't understand what you want or don't want.
So I guess what I'm saying is, regardless of what DELEG ends up doing, right, it's really changing the semantics of how you get access to data, right? Or, this is the steps you're going to go through. It turns out we have a better protocol. It turns out, we have a better way of jumping through multiple name servers. What I would hate is for existing clients today to not be able to get access to those same records one way or another. So if I, as a stub, ask for the DELEG record to my recursive resolver for some zone, I should be able to get it, even though I'm asking over port 53 over regular DNS, and the upstream is actually using DELEG in order to get that information. The semantics of how resolution happens and how that data transfer happens is independent of inside the entire DNS ecosystem. I expect to be able to, at the stub, get access to any of it, regardless of what I am using as a transport or a mechanism for resolution.
In other words, if I understand correctly, you want stub to be able to ask any name and type combination and get the RR set, no matter what happens behind the scenes.
Right. Query name, query type, and
class. Let's not go there. Yeah, but I mean, basically, the stuff has to work the same way as it does today, in other words.
Yes.
And then the resolver does some magic, but the magic has to be expressible. The result of that magic has to be expressible in the old format, basically. Yeah. Okay, we are on the same page then.
Yeah, so I think if I were to aggregate that into a way that fits into a way that you described the two distinct protocols, Peter, is that even though we might be using DNS over port 53 from stub to recursive, we still need to be able to share records back that we get over a different transport mechanism that the recursive is using to talk to the authoritatives.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I will add one more point, that today lots of message parsers will explode on some messages between the client and authoritative, because, for example, the DNS update message will not parse as a normal DNS message. So, and that's used exclusively between something and authoritative server. So even the pretends that we can reuse the same library to parse messages on both parts, like between stub and resolver and resolver and authoritative, doesn't hold even today without changing, without DELEG or anything. Just another data point to illustrate that these are different protocols.
Right. Ben.
Yeah, I can't let this go unchallenged, right? There is one DNS protocol. It has modes, for sure. It has potentially several different modes. But it's specified as a single protocol. From the very beginning, it has always been specified as a single protocol. It's generally implemented as a single protocol. If you go into DNS Python, if you go into any of the Golang DNS implementations, it's not like there's an implementation of the parser and even connection establishment that is like is exclusive to one use case or another. That's all just setup flow that's shared across all of the use cases. And then there's some dividing line in the stack, and above this point in the stack, it splits, and the different use cases have different needs. Also, if you're building a like massively widely used, highly optimized implementation, then a lot of abstractions go away. This is kind of universal across IETF protocols, right? The IETF provides the big blocks that you glue together, and then if you're trying to fine-tune things to the max, then you break those barriers, you pierce those abstraction barriers, and you find all sorts of tricky optimizations. But you shouldn't have to. We should be able to, in this case, build DNS endpoints of different kinds on top of an abstract DNS protocol that we can describe in some reasonable way, where you provide it the bootstrap information it needs to connect to a server, and it can serialize messages and return the responses.
Paul.
I'm going to disagree strongly with what Ben just said. That has not been historically true. We have, starting with RFC 2181, it got messy very quickly. And if you look at anyone's description of the design of the DNS, like how the DNS works today, it does not follow what Ben just said. I think that was a lovely idea 30 years ago, and I don't think that Paul Monkapetris could have predicted where the divergences would happen. Actually, he could have predicted, but he is a human. I believe where the DNS is now, that saying something like, because the ADD working group started 5 years before the DELEG working group, and they had a set of tools that they could use to solve their problems, therefore the DELEG working group has to use the same tools because those got used earlier, just is counterfactual to the history of the DNS. EDNS changed over time, things like that. So no, I really disagree that you can have a single object that says, oh, I already know these things, and therefore I don't need to know anything more in order to be able to do this other thing. Because quite frankly, until the ADD working group started, we didn't have a way to do any of what ADD does, which it now does with SVCB. So no, this is not an argument for DELEG, and all later working groups have to do what ADD did.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things we're going to have to unpack in that. If I go back to what Wes was saying, and anyone feel free to jump in and say if I misinterpreted what he was saying. I think the important part is thinking through what do the exchanges, what are the required information that needs to go across the exchanges between the different types of DNS implementations, or DNS entities as they exist. And I think some of the the points raised, point out that, there are some implementations of DNS that, you can essentially make do any of those functions, whether it's a stub, a recursive, or an authoritative. And then there are other ones that are a little more optimized to work in very specific use cases. So would people agree that what we should be discussing here are what are the necessary pieces of information that need to be exchanged between a resolver and an authoritative in order to signal the requisite DELEG information? Roy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we should step away from specific records, SPCB and DELEG, and see what we need to have at least a minimum amount of information. For instance, a delegation should have either an IP address or it should have a host name. Definitely not both, because that led to confusion as we've seen in the past. Petter wrote something about that on the list the other day, which I really, really like. So I think if we can have a set of minimal things that needs to be in this, let's say, DELEG record, and then we can discuss later on how we express that. For instance, as someone suggested, having key value pairs, which is similar to SPCB, but not exactly the same. So I just want to leave it there.
Thank you, Roy. Any other thoughts?
I would say that the discussion we just had before Roy spoke smells like a huge scope creep, because you are discussing whether these are the same protocols or not. But to me, that's not really the main point. The main point is that we set up working group to improve the way how we find where the name server is, and we are not talking about like redoing the protocol. It's just technically small change how you find the name server and nothing else. So I would like to stick to that goal and not expand the scope to DNS version 2, because that's not what we are trying to do. We are trying to improve the delegation, how we find the target of a delegation, nothing else.
Thanks, Peter. And you actually jumped into what I had scribbled down that I wanted to mention, is that we then have to think about this in terms of the requirements that we documented in our requirements document. And are we solving those problems as we're trying to accomplish this, and just keeping in mind that we shouldn't constrain ourselves to thinking in terms of the existing or proposed DNS messages as they exist right now, but thinking more about what's the type of information that needs to be conveyed in order to do what you were just saying. Eric.
Yeah, I think kind of on what Ben was saying, I think there's value in since it's desirable for at least some of the transports to be able to overlap between the recursive mode and authoritative mode, that some of the configuration parameters are going to want to overlap between them as well. It's certainly not that we want to use the exact same mechanisms as ADD, because how you configure what you need to do to configure a stub is very different than what you need to do to configure recursive for talking to the DEX name server. But some of the properties are going to be similar. So to the degree to which we can share similarities on those properties, on things like how do you know what certificate it's going to use, how do you get any TLS related parameters, etc., and how do you configure the protocol. For those sorts of things, if we can share things, that will reduce the amount of divergence between those two protocols.
Thanks, Eric. I think the point where this conversation is leading me, and I'm interested in other people's perspective, is with the way that the current base specification document is structured. Are there critical functions that we still need to think about how we incorporate into the DELEG exchange between an authoritative and a recursive. So, while the document has a bit more of the the message structure, are there key functions or capabilities that we think we also need to include? And I think Eric mentioned a couple of things that we would want to be able to articulate as attributes of the of the name server that the authoritative would want to signal. What are the other ones that people think that we need to make sure that we're focused on as we think about the functionality of signaling the information from the authoritative? Paul.
I'll just pop in with the negative of no, I think everything that has been discussed so far is fittable somewhere. That is, that I have not seen any requirement, anyone saying this is a requirement for the operation of delegation that was not fittable somewhere into what has been discussed in the base document or an easy amendment of the base document. Like you saw that once people started saying maybe we don't have to rely on SVCB, I proposed a bunch of text that would replace the current text with something that replaces SVCB with something that looks a lot like SVCB, and that may or may not work. No one has said yes, this is great. But I don't see any issue with starting from the base document with the requirements we've talked about and doing diffs from it. All of the requirements people have talked about, and I know we don't have consensus on any of them, do seem fittable. Absolutely.
Okay. If I were to stop for a second and go over what we've just spent the last 35 minutes talking about, I'd be curious from the document editor's perspective if there is specific types of information you'd like us to discuss that you think would be beneficial to moving the document forward into a next iteration. Peter.
It seems to me that at the moment it's kind of unclear what the working group would like to do in terms of the glue and other stuff which was discussed, and that kind of will determine what to do with the document. So I'm not sure that the editing the document is the most pressing problem at the moment. I don't know. If I look at the agenda, we have the question of how NS and DELEG records interact and what happens when they are both present. And that's something which is not well described in the document, or right now the draft basically doesn't say how the resolver interprets the record. It
Right.
shows an example as what an author that it would respond, but it doesn't really say much about the interpretation on the resolver side. That's an obvious chapter which is missing. That's something we can do, but that kind of ties to the desired behavior and the type of information we require from the author dev to send back to resolver. So I guess we can write like proto chapter and say, look what we've got, but I'm not sure whether it's a good idea to do that first and then discuss what actually we want to send to the resolver. But maybe in the interest of like making smaller iterations, maybe it would make sense to have something now and then change it like 5 more times. I don't know.
So what I want to avoid is asking the authors to just go off and write something based on what they think, and then having that be the the next set of discussion topics for the working group. I would rather see input from the working group that guides the authors in putting in the things that we think are important. And so when I hear Peter go, well, I think we have something we might be able to go off and write it. It does not give me a I don't feel like there's strong consensus on particular changes that we want to see in the document just yet. Paul.
So I think you're asking for two different kinds of changes. One is protocol specification, and I think there was general agreement on the mailing list of if you are sending back a DELEG record in the authority section, you do not send back an NS record. But it wasn't like 100% agreement. But let's say we get consensus on that. They could add that into the, they could make a 0-1 with that addition. The thing that I did when I also removed the SVCB, because again, I thought there was sort of general agreement on that, was I also reorganized so that somebody reading from the top to the bottom could see what are the protocol parts. I'm sorry, what are the on the wire parts, and then what does an authoritative do? What does a recursive do? And again, I tried to do it, and I don't know if I was successful, without changing anything that was actually in the 0-0. But so that's a completely different kind of rewrite. I'm happy to help on those if people liked that or not. But that's different than, and now we agree on this protocol change, get those words into the draft.
That's actually, I'm glad you said it that way, Paul, because I don't think I was clear enough. I was talking about based on the discussion we just had. Were there clear edits that the authors would be able to put in the document? And I sense from the discussion that there's maybe not a consensus on whether or not we want to think about this strictly separate from the from the SBCB record type, and getting more towards what Tail was saying about focus on the functions and identifying what are those missing functions. Eric had a couple of them that are, to me, show as attributes and can be signaled in probably any number of ways. But I think what you just said kind of starts leading us into the second agenda topic of how do we want the recursives and the authoritatives to behave when we have different combinations of NS and DELEG records. And I think that might help drive an 01 version more so than the topic we were just talking about. Ben.
Hey, so from the mailing list, I feel like there are 3 mostly separable, different open points of contention. The 3 that I know of are essentially transport parameters, glue, and priorities. I think these are mostly separate conversations, and we should probably pick one at a time. On the transport parameters topic that we've been going around and around on, I just want to say, I think the minimal thing that I would like to see is I would like it to be possible to declare, I would like to send this message to this DNS server in a way that is uniform across stub and recursive, and that means having some kind of uniform description about what it means to connect to a DNS server. Now that abstract interface might not exactly match what's in a record. Maybe there's a transformation. You get a service B record or a DELEG record. Maybe you have to perform some kind of transformation on it to ultimately produce some kind of abstract structure that contains all the metadata you need to deliver a DNS message to a server. But and ideally, I would like to minimize those transformations and maximize the commonality between these things. But at a minimum, I think we need to make sure that that exists. Today, basically, the only thing that we have that looks like that is the service B service parameter set from ADD. So I think that the easiest thing would be to just use it. It works. It's fine. It'll save a lot of headaches. But if we don't want to do that, then I think we basically need to define a new shared interface.
Okay. And so I think as long as all of those functions that we can identify look like key value pairs, then you can see where SVCB is a good fit. What I think we need to tease out is, are there other attributes that don't have that type of potential encoding? I don't think I've heard anyone in a mailing list say an attribute that would differ from that, but
so I actually think that essentially we've gone round and round on this topic enough, and we probably should move on. I think that ultimately in terms of points of divergence, the other topics, priorities and naming and glue, are more interesting and more likely to create a change.
Yeah. Okay. Paul.
I disagree with Ben about his list, because we just have already been discussing the one that I think is important on it, which is what gets returned in the authorities section for when a authoritative has both NS records and DELEG records for a zone to which it is actually doing a delegation. So I think that's an important one that can be discussed and finished on the mailing list so that the authors can put in a rule about that. I also want to disagree with Ben about transport. We haven't been talking about transport on the list. We explicitly pushed it off until after the first round, until after the current draft is finished. And I think that's fine. As somebody who cares a whole lot about transport, like Ben and Mike and other folks, Eric, I don't think that's going to be a problem as long as we have some key equal value pairs and we know which actions we are talking about. I believe we will be able to do transport just fine. And we don't need to do it now. That I have not seen anything where, if you consider transport now, it will change these other things we're talking about. So I would like to continue to defer transport questions, even though it's really only a deferral. I absolutely believe we're going to hit them, and we will probably come out very much like SVCB did. I don't see anything that they did that we can't do, or anything that we need that they don't have. But there are other issues that I think are more fundamental, namely, when a authoritative server has information that would live in the old world and the new world, what does it do in its response?
Thanks, Paul. Peter?
I want to make clear that from my perspective, the key and value parameters in SVCB are there, and it makes perfect sense to reuse it. So I don't think that anyone is proposing doing something else than key value in like SVCB-like style. Let's put it that way. The trouble I personally see with SVCB is that it's too prescriptive because it has a priority which we don't have use for, and it has a name which potentially is confusing, and we might not have use for that mandatory name in all three variants of DELEG record. So basically the case where you have a glue, then the name is meaningless and it just adds noise and adds confusion. So that's the trouble I see with SVCB. So basically if we strip the priority and mandatory name and keep the key value, even the var format for key value, and possibly the registry as well, so we have the shared meaning for the same binary encoding of the key and value pairs, that would work, I think. But it seems to me that like reusing it in full, including the priority and name, might not be the best fit for the DELEG. But again, perhaps we should first describe how the delegation works before deciding the var format.
All right, thanks, Peter. All right, so let's go ahead and jump to the next topic, and maybe we'll start seeing some things that are going to give the document authors concrete edits they can make, and that is what's the expected behavior between authoritative servers and recursive resolvers when NS and DELEG information is available for a domain, for a name server. So I would be curious as to people's opinions. I think the scenarios, there are some that we can clearly ignore. So if someone is sending a query and they don't set the DELEG bit and there's only an NS record, there's really nothing special there. I think the scenarios that become interesting are the recursive sets the DELEG bit and the authoritative has NS and DELEG available. Do we expect both pieces of information to be sent back, or because the DELEG bit is set, they only send the DELEG information back? Wes?
I think the even more interesting question is what happens when the DELEG records aren't usable, right? So, I mean, just my fundamental assumption is you should prefer DELEG if you can get a DELEG record back. But if they're not usable, do you fall back to the regular ones? I don't think randomly picking between the two is a wise choice.
Right. Roy?
Yeah, there's a fundamental security issue with falling back, right? I mean, anything can be, any DELEG record can be made false by flipping a bit somewhere by someone in between, and then automatically falling back to NS record makes the whole DELEG record. Yeah, I mean, there's a security issue there, so I don't think we should ever fall back. I do think we need to enumerate all the possible combinations, right? A resolver support, a resolver does not support. DELEG is present in the zone, DELEG is not present in the zone, and then describe for each combination what needs to be done. That's a limited list, and that just avoids missing one of the combinations here. I don't think we can actually go over that in speaking. We need a document that iterates over all of them.
So Roy, before you drop off, I have a clarifying question for you, and that is, when you said the authoritative supports DELEG and authoritative does not support DELEG, does that mean that the server is capable of providing the information, or are you also including that the information exists as a DELEG record for the query in question?
Well, neither. My point was actually we can. I mean, if you enumerate all possibilities, for instance, you have a server that supports DELEG, an authoritative server that supports DELEG. That's different than, for instance, a zone containing a DELEG record. Right. So if the zone contains a DELEG record, the server supports a DELEG record, the resolver supports DELEG and sets the DE bit, then send back the DELEG records. And there's no use for NS records because there's always a risk of falling back or whatever. We should not ever fall back. And since we should not ever fall back, NS record is in that case redundant.
Okay,
and that's just my opinion at the moment. It's not and I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. But my main point here was we should enumerate over all possible combinations. Some might be valid, right? You can't serve a DELEG record if the authoritative server is not capable of doing so, even though the zone might contain one, right? But you should also basically explain what the server should do in that case, or what the server is expected to do in that case. Thanks.
got it. Thanks, Roy. Philip.
So I think that for precursor to authoritative, we should have a principle that it's just either or. Either you get DELEG records or you get NS records, and you don't get both. And I mean, we can make a nice enumeration of what happens when, but I think this should be the guiding principle. But I think there's one other thing, and that is, I have the feeling that for diagnostic software, it is probably important that you do see both. There's probably going to be weird cases or just inconvenience that if you run, say, a dig command, and then it will only give you the DELEG records, or you have to remember to tell it to not get the DELEG records or something like that. So I think that there should be an option to get both, but it should be explicitly requested, and it should never be requested by a recursor.
Thanks, Philip. Wes?
So, having, as I think most people know, right, we made BRoot support TLS, and one of the things that we did was we architected our service out so that TLS runs in a separate process, so that if it dies, the rest of the service keeps going. And that sort of brings me to my point, which is, if I'm an authoritative server and I want to support both TLS and expect the person to fall back when TLS is down, maybe it's experimental, maybe whatever, I think we have to have a way of doing that. And if we don't expect them to fall back to NS records, then we definitely need to put in a fallback within DELEG itself, if the authoritative server picks it.
Thanks, Wes. Paul.
I would like to clarify what I think not fall back means with what Roy had said before, and I'm seeing there's lots of questions about that in the chat. In my mind, a response to a query that had the DELEG bit turned on should only have the DELEG records in it, not NS. But that doesn't mean, and just as I forget who said, I think it was Wes who said, but the DELEG records have to be useful. It is, and a perfectly good possibility is you get back one DELEG record, which is in include mode, and that doesn't work. Like, it's broken. The fallback at that point is that the resolver sends a query without the DELEG bit turned on and gets the NS records back, or sends back an explicit query for NS records for that. And I can see both ways on doing that for being explicit. But the question is the fallback the potential fallback records handed to the resolver in the initial response? And the feeling I got from the list was no, but that doesn't prevent the resolver from then doing something if what it did get back is not useful.
Thanks, Paul. Peter?
Yeah, I think that Paul is right, that we are confusing different types of fallback, because exactly as Paul said, the question is what the authoritative responds with, but if it's not usable, then we have a trouble because the DELEG, because it's signed by the parent and the NS is not, we are crossing the security boundary. So I think that a reasonable choice for the protocol itself would be to say, if you get DELEG, do your resolver magic on the set of servers you've got from DELEG. And that's what you've got, and that's what you can trust because it's signed. But don't fall back by default to NS, because if it's, if an attacker makes a DELEG query or responds to a DELEG query bogus, then it would fall back to insecure mechanism, obviously. I think Wes's point, he mentioned that, okay, so what if someone wants to advertise DNS over TLS, but wants to allow fallback to plain text DNS port 53 if the TLS doesn't work for any reason? And my take is that, well, then they should have DELEG for DELEG record, which advertises TLS, and a second DELEG record, which advertises DNS over port 53, because they are basically saying, well, we don't care whether it's secure or not. So they can advertise both, and then the resolver doesn't have to, decide for the domain, but the domain advertises the fallback is allowed if these TLS servers don't work, use these other servers. So I think that we should have minimum logic in the protocol and allow the alternatives to express the set of allowed transports, so I don't know how to call it, inside the DELEG record, instead of like inventing magic in the protocol.
Thanks, Peter. Ben?
Hi. So I think I see two questions here. One of them is, what are the semantics that the working group claims for DELEG? And I think we have consensus on this. If you publish a DELEG record, you are saying this DELEG RR set, or the resolution behaviors that flow from the DELEG records that I have published carry my full reliability guarantees, essentially. And I am, by publishing these DELEG records, I am not expecting or asking resolvers to use any other servers. I'm not asking resolvers to fall back to NS. And then there's the question of what will actually happen. And as long as some sizable fraction, let's say like 20 or 30% of resolvers actually behave that way and don't fall back to NS, then zone operators are in the position of having to make sure that their DELEG records actually are fully reliable. So I think we actually are in both of those situations. I think we have major resolver implementers represented here who would not activate an NS fallback in the default configuration. And I think the working group has consensus to write that in as the semantic of DELEG. To put up those records, they better work.
So I have seen bits and pieces of the chat go by, so I am perfectly willing to say that I don't have all the context, but I hear two different types of fallback, or I see two different types of fallback being discussed. Fallback between DELEG records and NS records, and fallback between encryption and unencrypted transport of that information. And to me, those are two distinct things, but they're both topics that we need to figure out. Wes?
So bringing this back to the IETF context, imagine that we are writing the protocol, the wording protocol for how to use DELEG. Is DELEG fails, is it a may, should, or must that resolvers can either use the resulting? So I should pick one side because then the chat will make sense, right? Is it a may, should, or must that resolvers should not fall back to other transport DNS mechanisms that they're more familiar with, like just DNS over 53?
Okay, Roy?
Hi. Just to go back, I don't want to confuse the two fallbacks and trying to make it into one, something like a conditional fallback. Like it's okay if you fall back if encryption wasn't used in the first place, but it's not okay to fall back if encryption was used. That will confuse the hell out of, well, at least me. So I'd like to basically discuss to focus on the one fallback issue, that if DELEG doesn't work from the resolver perspective, then just fall back to NS. That's the fallback scenario I'd like to focus on, and I don't like to single out the idea that fallback is conditional upon whether encryption was used in DELEG or not. Thanks.
Thanks, Roy. Paul?
Yes, we are somehow the fallback question between DELEG records that don't work and transports that don't work got introduced, and that's completely wrong. We aren't either we're not discussing transport yet, or we are, and I believe the working group was pretty clear that we're not. A failure of DELEG, there are two sort of classes of failures of DELEG as it is in the 0.0 draft now. One is that you get an include that doesn't terminate, or that terminates someplace that's obviously wrong. And the other is a direct that when you then try to use it, doesn't respond. Those are, in fact, really, really similar to what we have with NS records currently. And I think those are understandable. When we say fallback, I believe it is falling back out of the DELEG protocol into the classical protocol. I'm fine with the working group picking either, yes, you should fall back so that, and ignore the security guarantees that you had just a moment ago so that you can respond, or no, don't fall back because you had security properties and now the user's not going to know them and such. And this is what the HTTP people have, dealt with starting in 1995, and they came to a conclusion of no, don't fall back. Either way is fine, but don't pull in transport at this point unless we are going to fully describe transport in the initial one, and we agreed we weren't.
Thanks, Paul. Eric?
I think the place where that does overlap with transport is when we looked at this on the HTTPS side, and this may not apply here if we come up with a good enough MTI, but it's a case where there's no compatible transport found that works that the client supports. It's advertised in the DELEG records, and hopefully with a good enough MTI in the beginning, this is not going to be an issue. But 10 years out down the road, with things have evolved, and now there is DO, some random Unicode letter, there might be some cases where some really old client isn't compatible, and then I think thinking it on ahead a little bit on how do you want to handle those fallback cases is worth it.
Okay, so Eric, don't go away because this is an excellent question. I thought when you started this that you were talking about whether the resolver knew that it could talk over unencrypted plus one or more encrypted transports. And where you folks in the web world didn't have that was you had HTTPS : / and you didn't have a way of saying S or not S are both okay. At least in the way that the ALPN is described currently, you can, in fact, or we can extend it to say with no secure transport as well. That is, we can either extending ALPN or coming up with something that looks like ALPN, say, here are the transports supported, including unencrypted. And I thought where you were going was, if you don't including unencrypted, and you try to start up and you don't get anywhere, then you don't have a good fallback. And I think that is a very good question, because I believe that an authoritative server operator who's being overly optimistic might only list encrypted transports without understanding all the problems that the web world has discovered over the last 20 years, 30 years, of, when that doesn't work. I agree with you fully. At the point where we discuss encrypted transports, we have to think about failures and what does it mean to fail. My general feeling is, unless you have some high security thing where it's like, I never want to have it go over unencrypted, that you would always list DO53 as in your transport list. Does that sound right?
And I think that is a good way to think about it. I think like having the DO53 being explicit, if you want a insecure transport, you list it there, comes into play. And I think that also feeds into the priority topic, because where like in SVCB, the reason for priority records is not a go try all of these or try one, and if it doesn't work, fall back. It's really the here's an ordered list of things that are preferential. Pick the most compatible, the first one that's compatible, and then. But if that works, it doesn't work. That doesn't mean you necessarily go try next ones in the list. So we may still want priorities here as a way to say, yes, I actually want you to try DOQ first, or I want you to try. Then I want you to try DOT, and then I want you to try DO53. Right. And if you don't support one of those, then keep walking down the list. And I think the real question for this fallback becomes if there's nothing on that list, would you ever go use an NS record? In the HTTPS context, where we landed was no, you're not going to actually fall back to HTTP. In fact, it's the other way around. Of the presence of the HTTPS record says, even if you have HTTP scheme, don't even use it. The right. Presence of this record says use secure. So it's like, I don't think in the long term, I don't think we'd want like not having something compatible on the DELEG to result in a direct fallback to NS. And if you have the DO53 in there, then that would give you that would allow people to have a way to say yes, actually I do want you to do that. Right. I think there might be a question of like, would we want a service parameter that also says yeah, actually you can also I don't trust my implementation of this well enough. Go feel free to fall back and try NS. But I think if we were going to have that we'd want an explicit signal that indicated that fallback as part of the DELEG record. But whether or not, and I think whether or not supporting that as a fallback parameter adds complexity that may or may not be worth it.
Well, and having any priority of transports adds complexity. And there is, like you say, there's the question of, is it worth it or not? I want to point out one thing that you just said, and this may be some really horrible misunderstanding I had about SVCB. You just mixed up priority, in my mind, priority of records from priority of transports within a record. In my mind, SVCB, the priority records and the things that I think many people have been pushing against in DELEG is actually priority of where which you are delegated to. So that would be, and in the DNS world, we actually have highly expected that you will always have more than one name server that will serve exactly the same information. And nobody wanted priority between those two, which is what I think you get with SVCB, at least the SVCB priorities, whereas priority of transport has to do with what order are you giving the things in the key value pairs, or is there a second key value pair that says, if you understood that one, here's the way I want the list, or however that goes.
So in SVCB, it's a priority of priority of transport endpoints. So it's not meant to be a weighting of them. Right. We actually had that conversation on the hey, would we want to have a weight like thing kind of like the latter one you talked about, and we explicitly ruled that out of scope for for all of the same complexity reasons. So the priority in SVCB is really about within that, how do you order those various records, and you cross them out based, you sort them based on priority, and then you walk through there to find a compatible one. And then as soon as you find one that's compatible, then you stop, and that's the one you use. You don't actually do any fallback. You don't do any weighting of those. You don't do any round robin between those. I think when we have the kind of multiple, and this was one of those that because there's only the alias mode was defined or simplified to only have one target. Also simplified that because it meant that when you're walking kind of algorithmically as you walk through this, there is a single you effectively end up with a single SVCB record. That's the one that you decide to use. I think if we have multiple alias mode equivalents here, we'll want to anything that would be priority wise would want to look at this to treat those priorities only within an RR set of DELEG records. You would not, if you did have priority, you would want to say that these priorities are meaningless if you're looking at multiple ones returned. It's purely based on a transport ordering.
Great. That sounds like stuff that we would absolutely need to deal with when we start dealing with transport. But at least we don't need to do it for now. So great. That makes me happy.
And that might also be a reason that that if that actually addresses your concern, it may be that we either don't need to get rid of priority, or we'll actually want that priority later when we deal with transports.
Or as a couple of people have said on the list, we can get rid of it in the semantics, if we diverge from SVCB, and then have a priority key value pair that is specific to those kind of priorities that you've just been discussing.
Yeah, but I think it is worth kind of carefully reading how SVCB does this, because it may be that SVCB that it's actually a reason not to diverge rather than a reason to diverge.
I didn't understand that reading it, so it's good to hear that. Thanks. Yeah.
All right, so delving a bit into transport, but I think it's worthwhile for people to keep in mind that the priority may be useful in some form or fashion, whether it's in a SVCB or in whatever format we just discuss. So the previous discussion around whether or not a fallback from a DELEG record to an NS record, I think I heard consensus that what we really want to do is sketch out all the potential combinations of things that we have going on, and which ones how are we going to cover those different combinations. I think it was Roy who kind of spelled that out as being a useful exercise. I think that's a good way for us to talk about when each record type gets sent back, and when it doesn't. So I think that's a good piece of work to get into an 01 version of the document. Does anyone disagree with that direction? All right, I'll take resounding silence as at least a good direction to move in. Anybody else have something they want to say about how recursives and authoritatives handle the different combinations of NS and DELEG? Okay, so that clean.
Hey, I do have something to say about that.
Sure, go ahead.
So imagine that you're that you've outsourced your authoritative server operations today and you're using an NS record. I think if there's no fallback from DELEG to NS, then we need a way to represent that in DELEG as well. In particular, imagine that you've contracted essentially 2 secondary name servers. So you have 2 NS records, and one of them points to Route 53, and one of them points to Azure. One of those operators decides to become DELEG aware. You'd like to be able to make use of their DELEG capabilities. That means you need to synthesize a DELEG record for the other one, which isn't yet DELEG aware. If the DELEG record doesn't have a way to represent an endpoint by name that doesn't itself have a DELEG record, then you would have to hard code its IP addresses into your zone, in fact, into your parent zone, which I think would be operationally undesirable. It would mean that if you imagine that you're in, say, AWS's position, it means that your customers are now taking a hard dependency on the specific IP addresses of your resolvers, which you now can never change. So I think that my conclusion is that this does push for a mode where we can actually, Peter's mode number 2, where we have a way to refer to name servers by name.
Okay. Peter.
Can I? Okay. I didn't want to interrupt you again. I agree that we have to have the way. There is a horrible hack that you can have, like, create your own include target and put it there, but let's not go there. I think that the NS should be representable in the like. So I fully agree with you that it makes sense, because eventually I can imagine that some operators of parent zones might be basically creating NS records out of DELEG, because it's easier for them to manage only one piece of information and synthesize the answer inside their server or provisioning or whatever. So I think that we need that ability to express both.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Paul?
So this definitely hits on the question of what is the base key, the base thing that a resolver wants out of the delegation. If it's an IP address, then I don't think we need to be able to say, at this point, I don't think we need to be able to say, this is like the NS record, because that just becomes indirect or include. Include says, I don't know the IP address. Here is the name. Go figure out the name however you want to. And that can be through DELEG. Or if you don't get a DELEG answer by doing it, you would look it up in the classical. So either Petter is right, and we will have something that says only look at classical here, or we change the rules for include to say go through the DELEG process to get that. And if you fail, you're still holding a name and you don't have an address yet, then you should be going out to the classical. Those two are mechanically the same. One is slower than the other by one round trip, or maybe possibly multiple round trips, but the semantics are the same, assuming that the working group agrees that what we really want to get to are addresses, not names.
Thanks, Paul. Any other thoughts on that topic? Because I think this is a place where we need to have as much diverse thought as possible, because there are so many different corner cases as to how people deploy and use DNS services. Ben?
Hey, so I think if you imagine handling this with include, then I think what you would do is that upon receipt of an include, you would fire 3 queries for the specified name for possibly DELEG, quad A, and A. I think that's a plausible architecture. I wonder what people think of it. In particular, the thing that makes that interesting to me is if you go down that path, then does it really make sense to inject the addresses into the DELEG record, or should we just say no? You have to issue all 3 of those queries, and you'll get the address records from the address queries.
So Ben, I think it's interesting. Eric's comment in the chat that he meant the include points to the same name that an NS record would point to, and I think I agree with him that that's what I heard you say. Is that kind of?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Philip.
So I was thinking, if we have introduced a concept that we should be able to generate NS records plus associated glue from DELEG records, which I think is a desirable goal, because that allows registries to only have DELEG records and just have sort of legacy NS records that they generate, then we probably need to make sure that all the different types of glue are actually handled. And I have the feeling that with removing the name and only have IP addresses, or the other way around, that we only have IP names and no IP addresses, we make this impossible, because there's certain kinds of sibling glue that are sort of this half mixture of like, well, the name is definitely not in the child zone, but still there is for some reason glue in the parent zone. So if we make this an either or, then we have to make sure that that is really okay with big parent zones. That's why I call it.
So Philip, if I try and repeat back what I heard you say, is it we want to make sure we have a clear picture of what the operational guidance is for when DELEG include is used versus DELEG direct, and what you need to do in order to synthesize the NS record if a querier doesn't indicate support for DELEG?
It's about generating a zone from the DELEG records.
Right.
So I think we need to specify if you have DELEG records in the zone, and we assume that, well, not actually in the zone, you have DELEG records in your registry, and you're now generating a zone. So you copy all of the DELEG records into the zone, and now you're trying to synthesize NS records plus glue from the DELEG records. Do we have enough information in the DELEG records to actually make that work? And I have the feeling that if we say, well, we will just use include, then the registry of the zone will no longer have enough information to do this process.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on this topic? Because I think this was another one that there was quite a bit of disagreement over, over how this might work or should work. Paul?
You are completely correct that there's disagreement. I've been watching stuff flying by in the chat. This absolutely needs to be discussed on the mailing list with written out tables. And yes, Petter, we do need tables on this before we feel that there's any agreement. People are still having a hard time understanding each other's definition of fallback, and people are still having a hard enough time trying to figure out what a particular resolver, when it says it understands DELEG, what it wants and what it doesn't want. So I think this is going to take a bunch of mailing list discussion. I'm also actually pretty optimistic that we will, that with a bunch of discussion, there will be, perfectly understandable wording.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. I think the words will come out very easily once we actually have a common view of the various combinations of of things we have to worry about. But it will take a lot of discussion to get to that consensus on what those variations need to look like. Philip.
Sorry, I forgot to put my head down.
Oh, okay. Ben.
Yeah, so a question for the group, I put it in the chat. I think something Philip was hinting at here is, if we imagine that there are DELEG records that have IPs but no names, or in fact that there are no DELEG records that have both both IPs and a name server name, then to synthesize an in-bailiwick NS record from DELEG, you'd have to use a DELEG record that has IP addresses in it, which means there's no name, which means the parent would have to arbitrarily choose some name to put in the NS record in order to then populate glue records for that arbitrary name. So like, maybe you could use an underscore label. I wonder, like, are there resolvers out there that are going to fail if they encounter NS targets with underscore labels in the name?
The funny thing is that if we are talking about generating NS records and glue, we don't actually have to create a name which is inside the zone. The parent can invent a name which is inside parent's bailiwick, but it's not within the child zone, so it doesn't like step on authority of the child, because it doesn't matter. The name, the name is completely irrelevant. And if the parent, if they are willing to generate zone with glue, they can invent any name they like in their own subtree, like synthetic NS dot parent dot whatever, and that's it. I mean, the name can be arbitrary, and I think it would be preferable if it wasn't part of the zone they are delegating to, because it would, remove some confusion points.
Thanks. That's a good point. Although I'll just remind the listener that the names must be unique. So if you're going to generate them in a parent-owned zone, they have to somehow be derived from the child zone in some consistent and non-colliding way.
Not really. The name doesn't have to be unique. Only the mapping between name and IP address has to be unique. So the name can be IP-1-2.3 whatever dot parent, and that's it. And by doing that, you actually improve security, because if the parent zone is signed, you will get signed NS name, even though the child might not be signed even. Or, it removes the leap of faith first step with unsigned glue, because now you promote it to proper name. If you are willing to generate stuff into the zone, you can insist.
All right, Paul.
I just want to point out that we have just jumped into an assumption that if there are DELEG records, that there have to be equivalent NS records. And that has not been something that has been discussed very much, and I would want to think about it a lot more. My initial reaction is, no, there doesn't have to be. That is, there is an NS world and a DELEG world, and if you, a resolver, has asked to be in the DELEG world, then you get DELEG answers. And if you've asked to be in the NS world, you get NS answers. And you can decide about falling back or falling forwards or whatever. But I think it would be a hell of a lot clearer if we kept the two worlds separate and we didn't try to build bridges that might not get built correctly.
All right, Peter?
I think that we shouldn't do that in the protocol at all. This is a possibility for a zone maintainer if they decide to do so. I definitely wouldn't put anything like that inside the protocol. So, I mean, the RFC might mention it in one sentence in somewhere in appendix, but I would definitely not do that in the protocol. It's more like making registry maintenance easier if it makes sense. But I mean, we will see in 10 years from now.
Okay, I'm thinking through what Paul and Peter just said, and then trying to pull back in some of the context that Philip had mentioned about synthesizing, but I think that's more from a registry to a zone, so may not be as applicable here as my brain originally thought it did. Okay, do we have other thoughts on this topic other than the fact that we need to have some work on pulling together various tables of combinations of things that we need to drive discussions on the mailing list? Thank you, Vladimir. That's kind of where my brain was, is that's the synthesizing part of it is probably a little early, but we are going to have to address that at some point, because we will have to worry about what the what kinds of capabilities need to exist for people to transition from an NS world to a DELEG world, and that may be one way of doing it. All right. Anybody else have topics they wanted to cover? Paul, you had brought one up. Was there a particular message on the mailing list that you were thinking of when you were adding this to the
No,
agenda?
and it was the general one that we've touched on a few times, which
Right.
is are we ending up at names, or are we ending up, or I'm sorry, are we ending up at names with IP addresses as sort of metadata, or are we ending up at IP addresses and the use of those IP addresses in some transports are going to need names as metadata?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and you're right. I think we did touch on that a couple of different ways. All right, so if we got about 20-ish minutes left for our schedule, are there particular topics or any additional topics people want to touch on as a part of AOB, or should we start talking about Tails' request about what kind of guidance we want to give the document authors and what kind of timelines we want to look at coming out of the interim? Roy.
A couple of weeks ago, I sent a mail to the list about separating topics in different documents. And I think we came to the conclusion, it was between me and Peter, I guess, about 5 different documents. One of the things that is still up in the air, and that we haven't touched upon for real, is should we allow for more parent-side types? So DELEG would behave the same as DS. Should we allow for more types to behave the same as DELEG and DS? That's a question that I'd like to discuss at one point in time. It doesn't have to be now, but maybe I'll write it up for the working group, and then if people are interested, I can exactly, Peter. I can give a short presentation on that in Madrid. Let me know. Thanks.
Does anybody have any quick thoughts on Roy's comments? Peter.
Perhaps just a quick one that from engineering perspective, just for good feeling of it, it makes sense to me to have a range and not do one-off just in case we mess up, but I don't really have any like technical reason for it. It's more like DS was one-off and now it's everything more complicated because DS was one-off. So let's not make the same mistake again, but that's the only argument I have for this.
Okay. Michael.
Yeah, I'm just that last comment. I also think that we should set aside a range just for the convenience of implementers. But I wanted to say about the documents, I'm all for having more documents because they're easier to manage and edit and other things like this. But I think at the readability stage, at the end of the thing, that we might want to merge them, or we might want to publish them as PS with the idea that, you know, we'll merge them for internet standard for readability and consistency reasons. And maybe actually that's the best plan, actually, when I think about it, not at ID stage, but afterwards.
Okay, Paul.
I'm hesitant on multiple documents. The only reason having multiple documents might help the working group a bit, but if we don't combine them before we send them to the IETF, either the IETF gets 5 documents at once, which means we're going to get worse review, or it gets documents sequentially and all of the reviews will be, I can't answer this until, you know, I can't be sure of this until I see this other document, which is still following. My preference would be to keep one document, which is why I did sort of that reorg that I did, which was to try to make a document structure that made enough sense, that could stand alone, but the sections could easily and do cross-reference each other.
Okay. So you know, I think that there's probably some useful information around the structure and separation of content or non-separation of content, you know, as we kind of move forward. I know that when it was first broached on the list, you know, I just want to make sure everybody was aware that, you know, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between deliverables and documents. So, you know, we have the flexibility to do what is in the best interest of the community. So, you know, we should just keep that in mind. The other thing I will say, you know, going back to the discussion of what do we want to be able to do between now and Madrid to make some progress on the work. You know, clearly there's some discussion we want to have on the list, and it's going to be beneficial to have that with some, you know, whether it's text or tables or you know, what have you, that kind of outline the different combinations of things that we want to focus on. You know, we had talked about you know, with what recursives and what authoritative support, and what are the behaviors we want in each of the different combinations there. The key thing is, and Paul, thank you for sticking that in the chat window. We have 3 weeks. Draft cutoff is 7 July, which is 3 weeks from yesterday. So, you know, if there are things that we specifically want in the draft in 01, then the authors have to be able to work to that deadline, and that means that the working group has to have the right guidance to them in order to help do that. So what are the what areas do people want to focus on? I heard the being able to articulate, when are names and IP addresses used, whether it's, with using include, using direct. And then there are the combinations of capabilities between authoritatives and recursives. So I'm interested in what people's thoughts are on other discussion topics. Paul?
I don't think we're going to, in 3 weeks, have consensus on those. I think the one thing we can have consensus on is NS records in the authoritative, in the authoritative section, if you've got DELEG, and what those means. We may not even have consensus on that, but I think shooting for that as like the one topic that we're sure of doesn't mean we can't be discussing other stuff. But I think that's the only topic where we can know enough before then to assume by the cutoff. Now, remember, we also can keep discussing stuff after the cutoff, and depending on when we end up getting scheduled, an O2 draft can be issued like at the beginning of IETF week. But I would say 3 weeks from now, let's just get the does NS get included, and what are we going to say about fallback, where fallback in this case only means to NS, has nothing to do with transport.
Yeah, and so I think the other part of that is whether or not any of the tables or matrices of all of these various combinations, do we want those in the draft in order to have a record of what we discuss on the mailing list? Or are people fine with cobbling together those kinds of tables on the mailing list and then including them in the document at a later date once we've agreed on what the various permutations look like? Pedro?
Personally, I would say it makes sense to start on the mailing list, but in the end, I would put the final version into the draft for sure, because it gets confusing very quickly. So once we do the work, it would be good to have it recorded somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of whether or not people find it, from a architectural or archaeological perspective, being able to see the permutations of the table in various versions of the draft. But I'm fine with doing it on the mailing list and then having the consensus-based table put into the draft. I think that probably makes things easier for the authors, and it allows us to be a little more dynamic with the tables on the mailing list. So we can certainly start with that. And what I'll probably do is start with the one that we discussed related to the capabilities of the recursives and authoritative to get that process started. So going back to Paul's point on what the document authors should try and target by the 7 July cutoff, around when is an NS included in the authoritative section? Are there other pieces that people want to hopefully see in a draft version 01? All right, so I will take resounding silence that the focus should be the 01 version having text in it around on how we're handling the inclusion of NS records in authoritatives. All right, so we have 10-ish minutes left. Are there other topics or quick things that people want to bring up with the group that we have here? All right, Dwayne, anything we need to cover from a chair perspective that you're concerned about?
No, I can't think of anything. I think this meeting was very good. We covered a lot of topics. So I think we're going to be in good shape.
All right. So I will make one last call for anything that people want to bring up. Otherwise, we can call it a meeting and we can get people on their way. Peter.
I would like to get people thinking about the nameless glue, I don't know how to call it, the delegation to an IP address, because only very few people said something about it on the mailing list. And if we do that, it will change pieces of the text here and there. So from my perspective, it would be good to make up our mind, like collectively, if we want to go there and like diverge from the existing old DNS protocol or not. I don't need answer now. It's more like, please think about it and let's discuss.
Okay. All right. If there are no more topics to discuss, then we can call it a wraps and send everybody on their way. All right. Thanks, everybody. Once the Meet Echo does its magic, I will make sure that a link to the to all the material is available, and I'll send it to the mailing list. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day. Bye all.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian.
Excellent sharing. Thank you.